we're here today to talk about taking data offline in ArcGIS Online. And we'll touch a little bit about enterprise as well, because the patterns are generally the same. There's just a few nuances that you need to be aware of. Just, I guess, brief introductions, because we don't want to waste much time on it. My name is Paul Barker. I used to actually manage Collector for ArcGIS back in the day. I since have switched to the online team, but I'm still heavily involved in kind of the offline workflows and helping you guys get what you need to get out in the field.
My name is Chris Whitmore. I'm a product engineer on the ArcGIS Online team. Primarily front-end type of stuff, but it all kind of bleeds together whenever we're making a coherent product for you guys.
So, quick agenda. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I suspect if you're here, you already have a general idea of what going offline means and why you'd want to do it, but for the people who don't, I'm going to talk about it anyways. Chris is going to tell you guys a little bit about what you can do today with the apps across the ArcGIS platform. There are varying patterns of use to use maps offline. If you were at the plenary today, Ewan covered some of those different patterns of use. And the apps support different patterns of use, and in the future, some of them will support additional options. I'm thinking specifically of something like Explorer, who can work offline with mobile map packages. Going to give you some tips and tricks, and then it's not on here, but I'm going to talk about the new workflow that we've introduced over the past couple of releases, about preparing map areas ahead of time for offline use and why that is a pattern, particularly for Collector, that you should leverage whenever possible. So, why would you want to take the cloud offline? So, we are quite fortunate that we live in an increasingly always-on world. That being said, you still don't have to go very far to find yourself in a dead zone. For example, I live in the suburbs of Ottawa, and my basement is a dead zone. And my office is in the basement when I work from home. So, it's all too real on a somewhat daily basis for me. So, being able to continue doing your work offline is really important. Even in dense urban areas, you run into issues where you've got no connectivity. And I'm sure you guys can all sympathize, but not having an internet connection doesn't mean you get a day off work in most cases. So being prepared for that loss of connectivity by planning ahead can really make your field programs go smooth on a daily basis. And that applies to whether you're completely remote, maybe you're up in the Arctic or in the middle of the ocean, or if you're downtown Palm Springs. And while it's always nice to have a backup and having a pen and paper, has anybody here had to sit there and enter data from field notes? I started my life as a geologist, and we were graded, I think it was 15% of our mark for our fields program, and it was the number of illegible words on the first page as a ratio to the number of illegible words on the last page. And so the more you write, the lazier you get, the more mistakes you get, the more tired you get. And so always have a backup, but if you plan ahead, you'll find yourself rarely needing that backup, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris quickly, and he's going to talk through the different apps and what you can do with the various apps today.
Oh, shoot.
And we apologize in advance if there's anybody that works on Workforce in the room. We left them off from the app list, but go for it, Chris.
All right, so what can you do today? Well, first, as Paul mentioned, you can write with a pen and paper. But I think we were far past that. So more of the question is, what can you do with ArcGIS apps today if you want to go offline in the field? Well, a few things. First, and I'm sure many of you are already aware, you can go offline with Collector. You can download and edit data in a web map, and there's a couple different ways you can take your map offline. You can set things up for going in the field. You can also do the similar things with Navigator for ArcGIS. You can take mobile map package on the field and navigate offline. And Explorer for ArcGIS offers similar with viewing and working offline, while it doesn't have an editing aspect. And you can take the full desktop product, ArcGIS Pro, offline and edit data locally. And then finally, with Survey 123, you can complete surveys in areas that don't have any connectivity. So if you're going to suburban Ottawa, you can still collect data through a survey and through a form. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to do a quick demo with going offline in Collector. Let's see. All right, so I know I want to go offline in Collector, and I know what I need to collect and everything else, but so how do I get there? So you can start with your own data if you need to. If you need to, modify, review, or update attributes based on some inspection, or you can start with a feature layer template. We added feature layer templates to support Collector specifically. These are industry-specific, empty feature layers with a defined schema. Oh, did not. Well, that's
right on Chris's screen.
Yeah. Let's see. Is that better? Oh, that's worse. All right. Not sure how this is going to go.
Bear with us. Chris's computer is very old and very large.
Yes.
Do you know what number that is?
1.
All right.
All right.
Okay, you're extending your monitor. I think that's why.
Are you kidding me?
Hit Windows P. There you go. This guy.
Oh. What?
Second screen. Oh, no, you need the...
Sorry, believe it or not, I did a session like 30 minutes ago and everything was fine. Duplicate?
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry about that, guys. We'll get back on track here.
All right. So starting kind of over. So you want to go offline in Collector, and you may have some data already that you want to review. In this case, you actually want to create a feature layer from scratch. These templates have industry-specific schema, fields and domains and things like that have been developed by our solutions groups in concert with the Collector team for workflows that many of you use now. So I have a few different options here. And I'm going to find some hydrant inspections. That's what I'm going to collect, as it were. All right, so what you see now is that you have the two layers that are included in the schema. One's a hydrant spatial layer, and the other one's the related table for capturing the inspection itself. Now, the other thing I want to call out is that there's an option for enabling the capture of GPS receiver information. And what that does is it adds about 15 fields to the layer schema. And when you load this layer in Collector and you start collecting data, Collector will automatically start populating those GPS receiver metadata fields. So stuff like accuracy, stuff like information about the receiver, all sorts of different things. So that's when you get back in the office, you can perform diagnostics on the data to see, was it accurate enough? Do you go back and collect this point?
Great question. Is that using an external receiver? Yeah, you can hook up a high accuracy GPS receiver, and it will additionally store all that information. So if you have auditing requirements that you need to capture that as part of it, you can do that. So.
All right, so I'm just going to set the extent for this, give it a title. So whenever you're building a web map to take offline in Collector, you need to start with an editable layer, an editable feature layer. And that's what I'm doing here. Let's see, I have another one created. And I have one already created. And that layer needs to be editable with whatever editing settings are appropriate for your workflow, and then also sync enabled. These feature layer templates, they are created with both of these enabled, so they're data collection ready. They're ready to be added to a web map and go out in the field. And you see that the layer is empty. It's ready to collect data.
If you do have reference data, that data doesn't necessarily need to be editable. That can just be sync enabled. So you can still have your roads, lakes, rivers, all that base mapping as read-only data. It just needs to be sync enabled to go offline. But Collector does have the requirement of at least one editable layer to collect data on. So you need at least one.
All right, so I just added this layer to a map, and now I'm just going to save the map. Now, the other part that needs to be offline ready is the base map. In this case, all Esri base maps are offline ready. You don't need to do anything else. You're just ready to go. Now, if you're an enterprise, there's an extra step that you need to do. You need to actually do some create a proxy so that your ArcGIS Online credentials are used to actually take the base map offline. There's documentation for that. I'm not sure if we have a link in the slides or not.
No, but I can. It's in the collector doc, and it's under taking maps offline. And there's a few extra steps for Portal. If you are an enterprise user doing this workflow, you do need an ArcGIS Online account. And my understanding is that for this use case, you can get an org of one user to support this use case for enterprise users. So if you need to go offline, that's the same for both vector and raster tiles if you're using the new collector Aurora. So, but yeah, in online, no extra steps required. Portal has a few extra steps for now. So.
All right, cool. So at this point, the map is collector ready. You could go in the field and take it offline. You can share it with whomever you need that they would be going out in the field, and you can start doing data collection. However, there are still some optimizations you can make, and the first is that, in my case, I had an empty layer, but say you already had some layer that's, maybe you've had 3 weeks of data collection. Maybe it's already, you're starting with a layer that has a lot, and you'd actually review in the field. So you can do things that streamline how data is taken offline and synced back later, because I'm sure if you go offline a lot of your life is spent syncing data back and forth. So you can decide how you want to fetch or sync up editable layers. You can have the device download and get updates of features and attachments each time, or you can have the device will download and then get updates for features only, or the device will never download or get updates for features. So that would be the lightest footprint possible, that really you're just collecting data and sending it up. You're not actually retrieving anything. And so maybe you won't be aware of other edits in the field or other editors in the field, but that's okay. And then finally, for read-only features, what Paul was talking about a little bit ago, maybe you have a reference layer that also has attachments that you can compare it to and things like that. You can streamline that workflow as well. If you need all attachments, you can bring them down. If you don't have to. And then finally, for the base map part, is that if you don't want to use Esri's base map, if you have your own base map, imagery data, or whatever else, that you can then specify that you have a tile package that you're going to sideload. And if you specify the package file name, that collector will automatically look for it.
So this workflow is coming soon to collector Aurora, just to qualify. So this allows you to complete that sideload base map story. Great question in the front.
So I saw that in the new collector that's rolling out.
Yep.
We've been using tile map packages as a workaround for a while.
Yep.
What is the benefit to switching to the new capability? Will the new capability use credits, or will it just be a better version?
It's a great question. What's different about this with what collector did, the original collector did, and does it cost more, or is it just a better version? And the answer is it's just a better version. So you can imagine a scenario. This allows you to not have to, in the old collector classic, when you went to download a base map, it would scan, see if you had any base maps on your device. Your field user was responsible for picking that right every time. Doing it this way, they don't even get asked the question. So if you define that, it's going to look on the device, it's going to find that base map, and they don't have to do that mapping, which means there's not 100 people that potentially can get it wrong. Other than that, it's exactly the same. So, yeah.
That's one way to put it. All right, so that's setting up your web map and optimizing how you want to take features offline and sync features back. Now, the next thing Paul's going to talk about is building on that and map areas.
All right. So yeah, what Chris showed you, you can save a considerable amount of bandwidth in download time by skipping attachments, like Chris showed, when you don't need to view them. So it will never affect your ability to collect attachments. All it's going to do is affect your ability to get other people's attachments. And so, yeah, if you've got a field program out where people are inspecting, they really don't need to see everybody else's fire hydrant and download them. It doesn't add value to the field program, but it does take a lot of data and slows people down. So take advantage of those. They really do help kind of that overall field experience. So it's in the same thread of improving the field experience, let's talk about map areas. So is anybody already using map areas with Collector Aurora? Awesome. So map areas really are exactly what they sound like. They're an area that's been packaged ahead of time for offline. So it allows that data administrator or that person supporting that field program to define areas ahead of time. And the reason you'd want to do that is because it saves time, it downloads faster, and similar to the approach we've taken with the side-loading base map, it puts the questions that need to be answered in the data administrator's hands versus the field user. So they don't have to guess at what the level of detail is, what the right extent is. They just need to know that, okay, I download Redlands or I download Palm Springs. So it simplifies kind of that overall experience. And let's just hop out here. I'm gonna pop open my map. Unlike Chris's, it actually has data. So what I've got here is a set of streetlights for the San Diego area. And if I go into Manage Areas, I think I have exactly one existing one. So what you're going to see when the data comes in, I'm on Wi-Fi, and it's going to be a little bit slow because it's a lot of data, but it's still loading pretty fast, all things considered. So what I've got here is streetlights are symbolized by the streetlight type. So as part of kind of a retrofit for LEDs, you might be going out into different areas. You can kind of go around the map. You can click on different things. Pop-ups and everything's still working here. But on the left, we've got the map areas that we have, and we can start creating new ones. If you have a lot, you can only have a maximum of 16 right now. That is not a limit we want to keep long-term, but right now you're capped at 16. You could filter by keyword. So if I wanted to look at maybe military, you'll see it disappears because it doesn't match. So if you click on this in the list, you can see a little bit of information about the data that's been packaged. I'm going to get rid of the tips widget, but you can see here that this data will refresh the packages for download on March 5th, and it refreshes weekly, and I'll talk a little bit about that more. And you can see one entry for kind of each feature service or base map. And say, you can refresh these individually if you need to. Sorry, yes, sir.
Is that refresh customizable? So you can.
Yep, I'll get to that in a second. The question was, is the refresh customizable? And it is, and I'll show that in a minute. So what we've got here, you can see that we've got the community boundaries, we've got the streetlights, we've got the world imagery. You can refresh these all manually if you happen to need that. But most of the time, you really don't need to do that, and I'll explain kind of in detail a little bit later. So let's make a new map area. So I'm going to come in here and click Create Map Area. I could also do this from the Sketch tool. And so maybe I wanted to come in and kind of capture roughly Mission Park. Give it a name. And I can adjust my level of detail here. And that's for the base map. And so that defines kind of how far they can zoom in, how much detail they can see on the base map. There are limits. So if I drag it over here, it's going to turn red and be very hard to see against my poor cartography. But basically that means that it's too large to take offline. So if you reduce that back down to a size that fits, we're good to go. And so here's the package, the update schedule. So you can define a number of different settings here. And I just want to call out that in the context of going offline, it does not really drive when your field users get updates. They're going to download this data, and they will synchronize to get updates the same way that they've always done. The only reason this is there is so that you can match the refresh schedule to whatever periodic updates you have inside of your organization. Say Collector downloaded data that was already packaged and happened to be stale. You're not going to get stale data because Collector downloads the data, it will call synchronization and get anything that has been added, deleted, or updated since that data was last packaged. This scheduler is purely to minimize that step and make that step a little simpler, and you want that, so it just makes it faster. All it's doing is periodically updating the files on the server so they don't get too out of date. Field users, whether they're in Collector or eventually Explorer, will always see the most up-to-date information with this particular workflow. So if I hit save, it's going to go off and start packaging. And so what it's mechanically doing right now is it's going out to the feature service, it's requesting offline replicas, creating tile packages, copying them back into ArcGIS Online, and storing them. And they all have relationships, so they stay together. While that's doing that, I'm just going to hop into the one that I've already made and talk about some options here. So if you look at the overflow menu here, you'll see a number of actions. So you could edit an existing map area. So maybe your area wasn't big enough, so you could adjust that. Maybe you didn't put enough detail in your base map and you had to go back and recreate it, and you wanted the name to stay the same. You could do that. Recreate, think of that like a hard reset. And recreate is there if you make schema changes to the data. I realize it seems quite ominous, and because of that, we have, when you click recreate, it actually doesn't immediately recreate. It tells you what it's going to do, and it tells you why you might want to do that. Most of the time, you will not need to do recreate versus just the regular refresh. But if maybe you added a domain, maybe you deleted some fields, that information will not propagate through your offline workflow until you kind of delete and recreate that stuff. And so this is, if you know you're in that scenario, you run this. And to make it a little more efficient, if you had multiple map areas, you can batch select from the list view and do the exact same actions. So refresh. The refresh is going to do something slightly different, and which is why they're called slightly different names. Refresh is really about picking up changes from the map. So if you've added and removed layers from the map, refresh will repackage and update that data for the next person to download. If you change the advanced offline settings that Chris made in the web map, it will pick that up and it will delete the package that's there and recreate a new one that's appropriate based on those settings. So, and delete does exactly what it sounds like. It's going to delete your map area, and away you go. And so the nice part about this workflow is in Collector, the field user is no longer has to answer all those questions about going offline. They just know their zone they work in, and they download, and away they go. So that's kind of what you can do today. And if we hop back out to the slides, I'm going to talk really quick about some general tips, and then we're going to just discuss kind of where we're going and what's next. So working in the field is hard. It's challenging. And even if you do it every day, there's all kinds of quirks that crop up. Earlier in my life, I spent some time working as a field geologist, and it's always an adventure. And in terms of the apps, you'll notice in that slide that Chris showed you, there's a lot of different apps. They support different offline workflows. Really pay attention to that in relationship to what your users need. If they don't need to edit data, think about using Explore. It simplifies the workflow. If they're taking a non-map-centric approach for data collection, think about Survey 123, things like that. And one of the biggest ones is go outside on a device that you're going to be using in the field before you give it to somebody. There is a lot of cartography that looks really amazing on a 28-inch monitor in your office that looks absolutely miserable in the field. And that could be color palettes, so pastels are a terrible choice. Symbology is also can be tough. What looks like it's the right size to kind of discern really similar symbology in the browser could be very different than on the device. So really take your time to look at that. You may have subtle distinctions inside those symbols that when you get out in the field and you're in direct sunlight, it's really hard. And take the time to make your pop-ups as clear as possible. If you have things like aliases that match your cryptic field names, take the time to rename them. It'll really improve the experience. And if you were watching the plenary this morning, when Franco was showing the editing in the web, some of the things that we're adding there down the road will make it even easier to add better descriptions when you're working in the field. And if you're not familiar with views, then come see me on the island afterwards, and I'll tell you about them. But view layers allow you to tailor the capabilities for different users without duplicating the data. So you could have one set of field users that can only update attributes. You could have another set of field users that have full access to the data, different things like that. And it doesn't duplicate the data. It just gives them a different look in window into that data set. And it really allows you to add control as well as just improve the overall experience. And if you've got lots of imagery, really use that sideload experience. It's the best way to get 20 gigs of air photos offline. So, did you have a question, or are you? Yep. Great question. Is there a maximum size to a tile package? And the answer is not really. We've seen people use tile packages upwards to hundreds of gigs. If you can store it on the device, you can load it, then you can use it in the runtime. So there really isn't a limit. Okay, then yeah, come talk to me. I have not seen a limit. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but maybe we could talk about it in a little more detail afterwards. So those are some tips, and we're almost out of time. So what are we going to do in the future? So I know everybody here is probably saying, can we have a polygon? I'd really like a polygon. And could I even make it from an existing feature? And that's something we're definitely going there. You saw some of the new sketching that has come into the 4x JavaScript API is really going to help enable us to do that. We recognize it as a requirement. And I'd like to go even one step further. I'd like you guys to be able to take a pipeline and say, well, I want to use the pipeline, but buffer 2,000 meters around the pipeline. We recognize the pipelines don't run north, south, east, west. And if you happen to have one that's northeast, southwest, you end up taking a lot of extra data offline just to solve the problem. So we are going to optimize specifically for some read-only scenarios for Explorer. So thinking about large deployments, scalability, being able to, every time a user calls sync, the server has to do work. And we're going to leverage the scheduling to basically have updates sitting on the server for them. So when 1,000 people call sync, it's not actually going to the database, figuring out the differences. It's downloading a file and applying those differences. So for users who have thousands of users in the field working with that data, constantly getting an update daily, that will really improve the scalability and performance of that workflow. If you're a Python person, you can do some of this today. You can automate some of the map area creation. And we'll continue to expose different options so you have finer grained control over it down the road. Recently, image services now support tiling. So if you opt to store your imagery as an image service, you could generate tiles, and eventually we'll be able to take those offline in the apps. And this is coming to 10.7 Enterprise if you haven't downloaded the early adopter beta. So in 10.7 Enterprise, you should have the same workflow. And 30 seconds to spare.
Nice.
Look at that. All right, so that's all we've got, guys. Please take the time to fill out your surveys. Appreciate you showing up. If you have questions, we can take some questions now. If not, think about it. Come over to the island, and we'll dive into more detail. Gentleman in the front.
Let's say that you were running a custom app using App Studio.
Okay.
The process for packaging data to be edited offline from a web app perspective is just the same.
It's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with how App Studio does that. I do know that Survey123, they're doing work, as I understand it, to be able to support the web map kind of workflow, similar to Collector. That you could associate a web map with your survey and download that. So I would assume that App Studio would get that functionality sometime after that, but it would be best to confirm with them, just to be on the safe side.
So we've got full 16 built out for an application that we're doing offline.
Okay.
And we've had problems where we've set up the area and then we change something about the map and those areas will no longer sync and we have to go redraw there and recreate won't work and a refresh have problems. Is that expected behavior? Is that just big layers? What?
It's a great question. I might have to dive into more detail, but the question is, if I make changes to my web map, my existing stuff should still work, right? And the answer is yeah, assuming that you don't delete things. Nothing about authoring a web map or changing the layers in a web map it has any direct relation to sync. So are you using Collector?
Yeah.
I would talk to the Collector team directly to get troubleshooting, but the web map knows nothing about sync. So unless you're deleting, the layer or deleting, stuff. So yeah, no, shouldn't. I would follow up with them. There may be something specific in the application that's causing it not to sync. I don't know, unfortunately.